The courtroom goes silent. Nick Reiner stands as the judge delivers a verdict that will reshape a $200 million estate. Not guilty by reason of insanity. His parents are dead by his hand, but the law says he can't be held responsible. And here's where things get complicated, because in California probate law, that distinction changes absolutely everything about who gets the money. Rob and Michelle Reiner built a fortune through decades in entertainment. Real estate holdings across Los Angeles. Production company interests. Long-term investments that were supposed to provide for generations. $200 million, frozen the moment their son was arrested for their murders. The entire estate locked down while criminal proceedings played out. Trustees holding everything in place, waiting to see what the courts would decide. Now they have their answer. And it's not the clean outcome anyone expected. The LLER statute exists specifically for situations like this. California law prevents killers from inheriting from their victims. It's a moral line written into the probate code. If you murder someone, you don't get to collect their estate. Simple enough in theory. But the statute has a requirement that becomes critical here. The killing has to be intentional. That word, intentional, carries all the weight. Once a court rules someone legally insane during the act, intent disappears from the equation. The LLER statute requires intent to trigger. No intent, no automatic disqualification. Which means Nick Reiner, despite killing both parents, is suddenly back in play as a beneficiary. His siblings see this coming before the verdict is even read. Jake Reiner, the eldest son, has been building toward this moment since the criminal trial began. His legal team wasn't waiting around for criminal court to solve their estate problem. They knew insanity was on the table as a defense. They knew what it would mean if it succeeded. The day the verdict comes down, civil filings are already being drafted. Because criminal court answered one question, but civil court can answer a different one. Romy Reiner, the daughter, aligns with her brother's strategy. Friends describe her as more hesitant, not about the legal fight itself, but about how it looks from the outside. Challenging Nick's inheritance means opposing the court's recognition of his mental illness. It means pushing forward even as the system acknowledges he wasn't capable of forming intent. But inheritance disputes aren't decided on sympathy. They're decided on legal entitlement. And right now, Nick is legally entitled. Rob Reiner anticipated problems with his son. Nick's inheritance wasn't structured as a direct payout. It was built through managed trusts with professional fiduciaries in control. Disbursements scheduled, conditional, heavily restricted. The structure was designed to protect Nick from his own impulses. Now it's protecting his money from everyone else. Trustees have specific obligations under California law. They can't just decide the outcome feels wrong and redistribute assets on their own authority. As long as Nick remains legally entitled, they have to preserve his share. That's not a choice. That's fiduciary duty. The insanity verdict doesn't give them discretion to override entitlement. It actually reinforces their responsibility to act neutrally. Jake and Romy can't rely on the criminal verdict to disqualify their brother. That path is closed. Their only option is civil court, where the burden of proof is lower but the challenge is steeper. They need to prove Nick acted intentionally despite a criminal finding that concluded he didn't. Civil courts can reach different conclusions than criminal courts, but they don't ignore what came before. Judges review psychiatric evaluations, expert testimony, timelines, behavioral patterns. Every inconsistency becomes a fight. Every delay burns through money. Meanwhile, Nick's legal status creates another layer. The insanity verdict triggers mandatory psychiatric commitment. He's confined to a state facility, subject to periodic review. He's alive, legally recognized, and completely incapable of managing his own affairs. That incapacity activates his trust completely. Trustees gain authority to preserve assets on his behalf. They can release funds for legal representation, medical care, basic living expenses. Not for control. Not for spending. But enough to keep his share intact. From a probate perspective, this looks like stability. From the siblings' perspective, it's entrenchment. Every month that passes without a civil ruling against Nick strengthens the argument that his share is being managed responsibly and doesn't pose immediate risk. Jake's attorneys start assembling their civil case. The strategy isn't to relitigate guilt. It's to reframe intent. They focus on actions surrounding the killings rather than Nick's mental state itself. Financial records get subpoenaed. Communications get reviewed. Any evidence of planning or preparation becomes critical. The objective is narrow but specific. Trigger the slayer's statute retroactively through civil findings. Prove intentional conduct. Strip the inheritance. Romy joins the effort, though she keeps a lower profile. People close to her mention hesitation, not about whether Nick should inherit, but about the public optics of the fight. It's one thing to pursue justice. It's another to be seen attacking a mentally ill sibling over money while he's institutionalized. Then there's Tracy, Rob Reiner's adopted daughter. Under California law, her legal standing is identical to biological children. Adoption eliminates any distinction in inheritance rights. But Michelle Reiner's separate estate plan reportedly treated things differently. Assets tied to Michelle's wealth, properties and investments that predated her marriage to Rob, were structured in ways that didn't include Tracy the same way. That discrepancy didn't matter much while Nick's status was uncertain. Now it matters a lot. If Nick's share stays intact, Jake and Romy focus their energy outward, trying to disqualify him. If Nick gets removed through civil action, redistribution becomes unavoidable. And redistribution invites questions nobody wanted to ask publicly. Which assets were community property acquired during the marriage? Which belonged to Michelle before she even met Rob? Which ones did Rob intend for all his children, and which reflected different family boundaries? These questions don't stay theoretical. They surface in depositions, filings, private settlement discussions. Each answer shifts the financial landscape. Each interpretation favors one sibling over another. The estate starts deteriorating while everyone fights. Trustees prioritize preservation over growth, which sounds responsible until you realize what it means in practice. Properties sit idle. Investment strategies become ultra-conservative. Legal and administrative costs climb into the millions. Every motion filed extends the timeline. Every hearing delays resolution. No one feels in control anymore. Nick can't advocate for himself. His attorneys operate within narrow constraints, focused on maintaining his entitlement under the trust structure. Jake and Romy communicate only through lawyers. Tracy stays publicly silent, understanding that any statement could weaken her legal footing. The family doesn't function as a family anymore. It functions as opposing financial interests connected only by paperwork. Here's where the outcome becomes less about who wins and more about what survives. Even if civil court eventually strips Nick of his inheritance, the estate may already be compromised beyond repair. Prolonged litigation drains liquidity. Delays erode value. Assets designed to last generations get consumed by the process itself. Probate specialists recognize this pattern in high-value estates. They don't collapse all at once. They erode. Quietly, legally, predictably. By the time final judgments get entered, the question isn't who gets the money. It's how much remains after everyone finishes fighting for it. Trust administration shifts from temporary suspension into long-term management. Trustees stop treating Nick's share as a contingency and start treating it as an ongoing obligation. Accounting systems get updated. Long-range projections are drafted. Asset preservation replaces flexibility. This shift matters because once trustees commit to long-term stability, reversing course becomes harder. Courts are reluctant to disrupt a trust that's functioning within its legal mandate. Nick's attorneys lean into that reality. They don't argue innocence. They don't challenge the facts. They focus narrowly on capacity and compliance. Psychiatric evaluations are submitted regularly. Treatment records get entered into the court record. Progress reports are reviewed during periodic hearings. The picture that emerges isn't rehabilitation. It's containment. And from a probate standpoint, containment is enough. Nick remains legally entitled. His trust continues distributing funds for approved expenses. The structure Rob Reiner created to protect his son now operates as a legal barrier against redistribution. That frustrates Jake and Romy deeply. Jake's legal team accelerates their civil strategy. The goal isn't persuasion anymore. It's pressure. They file motions that expand discovery. They request financial records going back decades. They schedule depositions that touch not just on the killings, but on family dynamics, prior conflicts, Rob's decision-making process years before his death. Every expansion increases cost. Romy follows Jake's lead, joining filings that freeze specific asset categories pending resolution. Real estate transactions stall. Investment decisions get deferred. Liquidity tightens across the entire estate. None of this changes Nick's entitlement directly, but it strains the estate as a whole. And that strain exposes fault lines that had been dormant. Tracy's legal position moves from peripheral to central. As Nick's status stabilizes without a quick civil resolution, Jake and Romy recalibrate their approach. If Nick can't be removed quickly, attention shifts to limiting how the estate might eventually be divided. That calculation brings Michelle Reiner's estate planning back into focus. Michelle's assets weren't identical to Rob's. Some properties predated the marriage. Some investments were held separately. Others were structured through trusts reflecting her own priorities, possibly including her biological children more prominently than her adopted daughter. Jake's attorneys start raising questions in private conferences before they show up in filings. Questions about which assets should properly be classified as community property. Questions about whether Rob's intent extended equally to assets more closely tied to Michelle's pre-marriage wealth. The language stays careful. No one challenges Tracy's adoption directly. That argument would fail immediately under California law. Instead, the framing centers on asset origin and documented intent. Where did the asset come from? Who funded its acquisition? What paperwork exists? These conversations don't stay private long. Tracy's attorneys respond by reinforcing the legal foundation of her claim. Adoption under California law eliminates distinction. Community property rules govern most of what Rob and Michelle accumulated together. Attempts to carve up assets based on sentiment or biological connection are unlikely to succeed in court. But likelihood isn't certainty. And litigation doesn't reward efficiency or common sense. The filings multiply. Legal fees climb past initial projections. Trustees authorize expenditures that were never anticipated at this scale. Administrative overhead grows. Financial advisors are brought in to manage exposure and model worst-case scenarios. Each decision is individually defensible. Together, they're corrosive to the estate's overall health. Nick's trust continues functioning, but even that structure shows strain. Market fluctuations affect valuations. Conservative strategies limit growth potential. Preservation becomes stagnation. The money still exists on paper, but it's no longer working the way Rob Reiner intended. It's just sitting there, slowly getting consumed by the conflict around it. The siblings experience this erosion differently. Jake becomes increasingly aggressive. His filings grow sharper. Deadlines get pushed. Procedural pressure becomes its own tactic. According to people familiar with the negotiations, his goal shifts from winning outright to forcing a settlement on favorable terms. He's willing to accept partial victory if it means stopping the bleeding. Romy grows quieter as time passes. Friends describe withdrawal rather than escalation. Her involvement continues, but her presence fades from the public aspects of the case. The legal process consumes energy she doesn't appear eager to replenish. Whether that's strategic exhaustion or genuine emotional fatigue, the effect is the same. She's still in the fight, but she's not driving it anymore. Tracy remains publicly silent through all of this. Privately, her position becomes increasingly precarious. Aligning with Jake and Romy against Nick seemed logical at first. Now that alignment carries serious risk. The moment Nick's share gets secured through continued legal inaction or favorable rulings, Tracy becomes the variable. The same scrutiny being applied to Nick's entitlement could be redirected toward hers. And everyone involved understands that dynamic perfectly. The trustees, bound by fiduciary neutrality, don't intervene in the family conflict. Their responsibility is to the estate, not to family harmony or fairness beyond what the law requires. As long as each action complies with their legal duties, the process continues regardless of how it affects relationships. Months pass. The civil case against Nick remains unresolved. Psychiatric evaluations conflict with each other. Expert witnesses provide divergent testimony. Judges request additional briefing. Each extension buys Nick more time and costs the estate more money. The numbers start telling a different story than they did at the beginning. Liquidity has dropped significantly. Some assets have depreciated. Opportunities missed can't be recovered. What was once a robust $200 million fortune now shows visible erosion in real terms. Settlement discussions surface again at this stage. Not public settlements that would involve press releases or court announcements. Structural settlements negotiated behind closed doors. Proposals circulate that would cap Nick's future distributions without formally admitting he should be disqualified. Frameworks that would isolate certain assets from the main dispute. Deals that would resolve claims without requiring definitive legal findings about intent or mental state. None of these proposals satisfy everyone. Nick's attorneys resist reductions that would imply culpability or voluntary surrender of legal rights. Jake's team resists any outcome that preserves Nick's long-term benefit from the estate. Tracy's counsel resists frameworks that would diminish her position indirectly by creating new categories of asset distribution. The stalemate continues while the estate continues deteriorating. Probate specialists who've seen estates of this size recognize the pattern immediately. When cases reach this phase, outcomes become less dramatic and more destructive. No single ruling collapses the structure. Instead, the structure weakens incrementally until resolution becomes almost irrelevant. The fight consumes what it was meant to divide. By the time final judgments approach, the estate no longer resembles what Rob Reiner built. It still exists on paper, but its power is diminished, its influence diluted, its original purpose distorted beyond recognition. What remains is entitlement without satisfaction for anyone involved. Nick may retain a legally protected share, managed by trustees, reduced by years of legal costs and conservative management. Jake and Romy may secure partial victories through civil findings that feel hollow given what the fight cost them financially and emotionally. Tracy may preserve her legal status at the expense of any remaining family connection. No one walks away whole. The system functions exactly as designed. Rights are honored. Procedures followed. Due process observed at every stage. But the family is finished as any kind of functional unit. The relationships don't survive the process, even if the legal entities technically do. The money survives, but diminished. The Reiner name continues, but attached to a cautionary tale rather than a Hollywood legacy. And that becomes the lasting outcome of this estate. Not resolution through clear legal victory. Not justice in any traditional sense. Just attrition. Slow, expensive, legally proper attrition that leaves everyone technically entitled to something nobody really wanted anymore. The insanity verdict that seemed like Nick's path to keeping his inheritance may end up being the mechanism that destroys the entire family fortune, not through disqualification but through endless legal warfare that consumes value faster than anyone can extract it. The irony is that Rob Reiner's careful estate planning, designed to protect his troubled son, becomes the framework for the family's financial destruction. The trusts meant to provide stability instead provide legal justification for years of litigation. The protections meant to preserve wealth instead preserve conflict. That's the real cost of this verdict. Not who gets disqualified or who keeps their share, but what happens to a fortune when the only thing family members can agree on is that they can't agree.